Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So before we run our
I'm really
argument,
sorry.
and this is the only argument with, and this argument will be how basically. Okay.
Sorry. Could you restart? I think there were some internet issues. I'm not sure if this is only happening for me. I'm not able to. You were like sort of glitching.
Yeah, we can't hear either.
Okay.
Was I audible?
Yeah, for a time you were not audible.
Please.
Okay.
So now he's fine, right? We can like.
Yeah, I think now, yeah, it's better. I can hear you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Before I run the first argument in this debate, which its impact isn't literally plus minus $50, which is that that big corporations will be the only ones who use this, and they'll use this to corner the market and monopolize it. We want to rebut opening opposition because we think the opening government actually doesn't do it. They don't rebut either of their two arguments. So their first argument is how this increases corporation incentive to go to, how do you call it, rural areas or poorer areas in developing countries, because now the purchasing power that they perceive that those areas have are higher. Note that this is ludicrous because the risk at best remains the same, because purchasing power doesn't actually change over time, meaning that you perceive them as just as risky people to sell products to, because their ability to in the long run pay for your sort of things is like still relatively low. But actually know that this increases risk to invest in these sorts of places, because if one of those people defaults on these sorts of debt, this is far worse for the corporation than if they never had made the purchase in the first place, because the corporation not only gets little or no money, but they also lose the product that they have in inventory. Meaning
I'm really
allowing,
sorry.
like, how do you call it? Things like substantially.
Sorry, I think you're cutting out again. I'm really sorry. I had you paused at 1 minute and 6 seconds.
At 1 minute?
Yeah, basically, yeah, pretty much exactly 1 minute almost.
Okay. Now it's fine, right?
We swapped the internet.
Yeah. I think now it's again.
Okay. I'm very sorry. This is shitty developing country internet. Okay, continuing in 3.
Check. What was the last thing you heard?
So the last bit that I had, I think, was how exactly this is increasing risks for such areas in terms of.
Okay. So the way this increases risk for investing in these areas is that default is substantially worse than not selling the product in the first place. Because default not only means that the corporation doesn't receive money or receives very little money, it also means that it loses this item in inventory, right? Meaning that the loss that it incurs is double. Whereas if it invests and it simply doesn't sell as much, the risk is comparatively lower. So the option of default actually massively increases the risk when investing in these sorts of places, which means that corporations are more reluctant to do this. It also means that if large default happens in these sorts of areas, corporations are more likely to experience bubbles or more likely for them to fail and a bunch of people to lose their jobs, right? Because defaults are very quick shocks that diminish your ability to do this. Second piece of rebuttal, and this is again not rebutted by opening government, which is their opening opposition's arguments about how, oh yeah, you can access things that you need without basically getting credit card debt. So the only thing opening government said is, but credit card interests aren't that high, but like they are. This is your average informed voter. You should reasonably know this. So 4 responses to this that don't actually rely on these credit cards not being very good. Firstly, notice in the vast majority of ways, in the vast majority of cases, you can, how do you call it, get the retail shit you need without actually getting credit card debts. How? By simply cutting costs, getting the cheaper phone, or getting the potentially food from the cheaper market and all these sorts of stuff, or getting the like less expensive clothes. When they are forced to do this, most people hate, how do you call it, interest rates, and they would rather simply cut their own spending. On their side, they would rather buy the more expensive things when they have the ability to do this, as opposed to on our side of the house when they can simply cut this sort of thing. Secondly, know that government has incentive for these people to basically not incur this. OG kind of mentioned this, but we want to specifically say this. They say in times of crisis, when you need these things to go to work and all these sorts of things, this is exactly when government does things like stimulus checks and all these sorts of things, because this is where they know that the purchasing power of their poorest people is at, how do you call it, their lowest. They don't want them to starve. This is a big electoral no-no, right? But this also fucks the long-term ability for the economy to bounce back. Thirdly, notice that on either side of the house, you are likely to take, credit card debt. Even if it's not for retail products, you need this shit to pay your rent. You need this shit to pay school for your children, right? In times where your purchasing power is low, you always need this sort of thing. And a lot of those things you cannot purchase from retail, meaning that you're likely to do this on either side. Granted, you might get it lower, you might get lower amounts of money, but notice your future ability to pay back is if anything lower, because you must now also pay back all the, the retail shit that you got, insofar as you need to pay back high interest rate, but you also need to pay back this other thing, meaning that the impact at best is extremely marginal. Fourthly, note that this is the outweigh. The vast majority of products that are going to be bought in this capacity won't be good products, because like OG gave some reasons as to why this is, but notice people fucking hate interest rates, and they're not likely to get these sorts of things from credit card companies, but they don't hate this concept as much because they perceive that they can pay the same amount, so they're a lot more likely to make stupid purchases that can later not pay, meaning that even if they get some money from this sort of thing, they're likely to lose a lot more money. But finally, this clash is literally plus minus $60. It doesn't matter. Oh, poor people maybe get slightly higher interest rates or late fees. Okay, you don't buy that much of your money from retail stuff, and you're likely to kind of cover both of those things symmetrically. So the impact of this clash is literally tiny. Then, what is the correct clash? Why is this likely to be used exclusively by big corporations? And how is this a uniquely effective way at cornering smaller corporations and establishing monopolies? Why is this likely to be used by big corporations? Two reasons. Firstly, notice that this very policy requires that you incur short-term costs. It means that you need to give out things from your inventory and then not benefit from these sorts of things for like a month or 2 months or 3 months at a time, right? Notice that the vast majority of smaller companies often cannot afford this because they don't have the necessary savings to incur this sort of short-term costs so they can get the long-term benefits. But secondly, notice that big corporations can literally purchase exclusivity. They do this through a third party. They can negotiate, Walmart, for example, can negotiate an exclusive contract with the corporations that do this, or they can put a patent on this sort of thing because they have great sway in the government. It's often very difficult to regulate them before in this sort of way. Yeah, I'll take you. Oh.
So you don't get diversification of goods because MNCs don't invest without guaranteed short-term profit. So there isn't competitive pricing introduced to challenge lower tier goods that then prevent people from saving because they have to buy these lower tier goods.
MNCs don't invest without long-term and short profit as well. You have zero long-term and short profit because if those people cannot purchase the goods currently, the likelihood that they'll be able to make these sorts of purchases over the long run is also limited. We also explained why this actually raises the risk, since people can literally essentially steal and then never pay you back. So MNCs actually incur far higher risk and are substantially more likely to invest on our side. But we just proved that, that bigger corporations are the ones who are substantially likelier to use this. Why does this matter? Because this generates a shit ton more business. It is far more comfortable for many people to do this. It is far more, how do you say it? Even if you ignore OG's analysis about how people do it irrationally, even if they do it rationally, it's more comfortable for many people, meaning that a lot more people will now do this. Notice, what is this likely to lead to? This is likely to people to leave, smaller businesses, because it is simply more convenient to be able to access this sort of service that is almost exclusively likely to be accessed by bigger corporations. Now, this means that these big corporations can essentially corner the market, and their market capital vastly increases since they're the ones who are likely or uniquely going to offer this thing. Why is this bad? Two reasons. Firstly, the vast majority of these corporations are often very shit. Walmart exploits its workers. The bigger they get, the more difficult it becomes to boycott them, the harder it becomes to regulate them, since they now have a substantially more money to influence the state. But the second reason why this is bad is they know they have long-term incentive to actually raise prices, right? Once they corner the market, they have an incentive to raise this sort of thing, which, if anything, this destroys top-cap clash, because it simply proves that people and poor people are going to be paying more for a certain good. How they're going to be paying it over time or in the short term doesn't matter if they're going to be paying for it more. Vote us.
I thank the speaker for their excellent speech. Would now like to call upon the MO to open the case for closing opposition. Here.
For POIs, please offer them in the chat. Two main contributions from closing opposition. Firstly, a far more nuanced look than our opening over why an immediate influx of money is not only really important to a lot of people, but can help prevent the spiraling of debt, therefore allowing us to win on government's metric. And then secondly, a far more nuanced look about what alternatives are, directly clashing with closing government over why this is likely to be a competitive industry that is better than all other alternatives. On to the first major contribution over why an influx of money is really important to a lot of people. The main OO contribution here is basically saying you can buy things like technology to operate in a really global economy. However, if you look at their examples, it's unclear why a lot of the things that they're talking about cannot just be things that are accessed over time via saving to a large extent. We're going to solve this gap by explaining why the timeline of purchasing is actually something that is really important. I want to make 3 observations here. The first thing to say is that this is often something that is needed in order to prevent costs from spiraling more in the future, where short-term purchase is able to offset that to a much larger extent. So I think there's a bunch of examples here. So like buying gauze to treat an infection in the short term can help prevent spiraling medical expenses of needing to go to a more expensive doctor when the infection ultimately worsens. Or things like if your neighborhood has a lot of bug infestations, preemptively buying things like just like things that remove the infestation of like insects, because it would be comparatively more expensive to hire an exterminator into the future. I also think that in some cases it's really important to make 2 purchases simultaneously at the same time where you might otherwise only be able to afford one of them. So like if there is a flood in your basement, you need to pay for both the new drywall and installation services at the same time, because if you can only afford one, then you're not going to maximize the benefit of what both services actually are. So insofar as gov teams are arguing that like debt is going to increase in the future, that's really bad. Our framing here is that making short-term purchases, even if you're going into some amount of debt, is a useful way to prevent debt from spiraling more into the future. The second observation here is that the comparative might just be awful forms of cost cutting in other areas if you like decide to save. So like you might be able to like otherwise buy the gauze that you need, but if that comes at the trade-off between your family not having sufficient food for a week, I think that is absolutely terrible. The final thing to say here is that there are often many kinds of loans an individual needs to make, and this allows greater flexibility in terms of triaging the kind of loans that are paid back. So you might have utility bills and you might have a business loan to pay back at the same time. I think that given that these loans often have relatively high degrees of interest rates, it's often a more efficient use of capital to use your previous paycheck in order to target other loans that you have, or at the very least to have the freedom to like do that, rather than further delaying those payments, especially if those payments have sliding interest rates, while still unlocking the goods that you need under our side of the house. So not only does this allow you to save more money, I think that we also flip OG here, because the comparative is if you also like if like your family owns a business and they also owe other people money and you default on that, this actually lowers one's credit rating. And I think that's a bad thing, because I think that there's certain people who can, in the majority of cases, pay back credit, but something bad happens, which can lead to a tanking of a credit rating, and we better allow individuals to buffer against that. The competing response that we get to all this analysis from like GovBench is like, oh, but there was a rationality gap. I want to make 2 observations here. Firstly, I want to give some more structural reasons over why like the poor are not stupid and can do this like smartly. I think that firstly, they don't want to get locked out of being able to use the app in the future. But even if like the first time they use the app, they're really irrational in how they do this, I think that insofar as you were like a regular on the app, you got pretty mentally used to the idea that in a couple of weeks, I'm going to have to make the payment into the future. And therefore you take this into account to a much larger extent. The second contribution that I want to make here is a valuable piece of weighing, which is that even if some people are like misusing the apps and end up defaulting, this has to be weighed against individuals who are making valuable purchases that are really important to them. So for people who are unable to like pay back the loan, I think that the comparative is either they would have used your credit card, in which case there's going to be some financial distress anyways, or they don't buy the product, in which case they use a utility, something in the majority of cases is probably something that is important to them. So I think that both of those are still losses, whereas if we contrast that to even 30% of people who are able to buffer against spiraling costs, that is a massive benefit under our side of the house. Before I get into our second extension, I'll take opening government.
So our argument is that people will spend less money on useless things because of nudge theory. That means they have less savings,
Okay,
and it's harder to
But
pay those time-sensitive costs on.
the problem is your case is predicated on the idea that poor people are idiots and are spending money on shoes that just look really, really nice. This is psychologically bankrupt. I think that people will think, I don't want to be locked out of the app in the future. I need to manage my money smartly and aren't like using this on stupid things rather than using it on like necessary expenses. Secondly, let's give a far more nuanced look at all other teams and on what the alternative is. The first piece of alternative that I really want to talk about is like this whole notion of credit card companies. I think that opening opposition identifies that this is an alternative. There's a large deadlock that exists in like top half over whether interest rates are really that much lower or higher, relative to like late payments that are going to exist. I think that there's a couple structural reasons why the app is way better. Firstly, and this is really important, apps can also make money via advertising, whereas credit card companies cannot do that as easily. When you're on an app to like make these purchases, we're often showing you other goods and services and therefore receive an income stream by other companies who are paying them to engage in that degree of advertising. While credit card companies engage in like external advertising, it's not the same in like app usage to the same extent because people are just taking their credit card and like you're swiping. There's not really advertising on cards to the same extent. The reason why this is really important is that buy later apps and have an alternate income stream that they are making via degrees of advertising, whereas credit card companies are almost exclusively reliant on degrees of interest rates that are existing. The second thing to say here, though, is that in contrast to the closing government extension, credit card companies are substantially more consolidated relative to lower barriers of entry that come to making these companies. The reason why credit card companies are really consolidated, so like in like North America, for example, you often have largely Visa and MasterCard competing against one another. I think there's kind of like a global monopoly that these companies have, is that credit cards often extend large lines of credit to other people because you're often also dealing with larger purchases like buying a home, and therefore as a company you need a massive capital buffer in order to actually engage in these services. On the comparative, we were talking about newer apps that people are willing to lose, and given that all teams agree that these are often for smaller purchases, the startup costs that you need are not something that are actually extremely low. I think what closing government says in response to this is like, yes, but big companies are just going to put a patent to negotiate with one company. I have multiple responses to this. First, like you cannot patent a payment system. Like this is why the info side gives example of multiple companies that are existing under the status quo, which is likely to increase in the future. Secondly, companies and retail associates are unlikely to make an exclusive contract because then they lose bargaining power. I think that companies want to take a cut of like late fees that are being generated, and the best way to do that is not to lock yourself in with a single company, but always have the option of being able to defer to another company. I think that thirdly, even if like Walmart forms a partnership with one company, I think that other companies can form partnership with multiple different things. Therefore, I think that we have structurally proven why interest rates are likely to be lower under our side of the house. The reason why this is good is that I've refuted like irrationality, right? In the majority of cases, people are going to be making purchases under either side of the house, but when interest rates are lower, we prevent debt from cycling into the future. I also want to note that this is logically prior to what we hear at the end of the DPM speech of like competition between credit card companies and this, because that is contingent on proving that these services are actually going to be more competitive and like offer lower prices. I think I've proven why that is structurally likely to happen by advertising revenue and competition. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
I thank that speaker for their excellent speech. Would now like to call upon the government whip to close out the debate for government. Here. Sorry.
Okay, I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Great. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just really fastly on CG, I'm going to get back to them, but those services are for retail. Retail is not going to the doctor, nor like calling exterminators. It is buying food from the store and some kinds of needs like clothes, for example. It is not like calling a doctor. And why is this the case? Because often companies like exterminators or like medical services probably don't have the capital to actually like get this shit done and like wait for the return of payment, and probably in most cases this will be just used in like some kind of services that are really cheap in means of like Walmart, for example. Therefore, I am first going to like engage with OO, then OG, then CG. What is OO case? Basically, they run two things. People will use it to gain access to certain things that will improve their lives. And the second thing is, market is really blooming, and that's really great. Okay, let's talk about people will gain access to certain things. Because that relies on people are going to be rational when they use this. I think that Clash was like really washy in like top half, so I'm going to just give 3 reasons why people are probably not going to use this rationally. Because firstly, know that those products are not that like costly for them. That means that probably they won't be in such values such as a computer as they portray. But secondly, know that they are short-termistic because they prioritize happiness. Often poor people live like really miserable lives. Probably they will like prioritize short-termistic happiness of buying those new shoes that will probably like make their lives a bit better. But secondly, know that they have a lack of financial education. That means nor their like school nor parents told them how to like save up money. Therefore, I am not so sure if they will like make the best decision in a moment that they know that they can buy the pricier thing. Probably they will do it because probably they will perceive it as something, as a luxury that they need in their lives because their lives are kind of miserable. But just thirdly, know that advertisement is really well done by like people that know sociology and some shit, and probably they will advertise it in a certain way. Know that a bit that makes OG case symmetrical, because I am not so sure if people will use have the ability to save up money in both sides of the house, but how does that actually compare with our side of the house, and why this certain rebuttal was to those products will probably not better the lives to the extent that we care. Therefore, what is the weighing? Number of people. The number of people that are going to be some kind of affected by this and made their life so much better probably aren't that much. On our side of the house, monopolies literally affect every single citizen. As those citizens, they can have increased prices on every single product because monopolies are created. They wouldn't have the same diversity on the market. Probably there is a lot of exploitation from those companies, and probably there is a lack of choice and agency for those people. Therefore, debt. Know that in a moment that those purchases are not life-changing, probably we win on the debt. Why is that the case? Because probably monopolies are going to harm you way more, because A, you cannot create yourself a small business, for example, but B, probably you will be forced to not buy the things that you want to buy because there is lack of diversity and the prices are increased. But just thirdly, long-term. Know that the long-term impacts of in that specific scenario probably aren't that big. It means of probably you're not going to have your life so much better. On our side of the house, things such as lack of diversity, exploitation, and choice and agency probably are something that weighs out their long-term impacts. Therefore, really fast on the market, I think my first speaker did a great job. But know that this increases risk and increases even more if those companies go to developing countries, for example, because developing countries are even more questionable if they're going to pay their shit. But know that secondly, this will, even if this actually makes a bit of market bloom, this creates bubbles because people are going to now invest in those kinds of situations. That means that probably investment bankers in certain point are going to say, oh, but that doesn't cost the same as we are paying for it, and they're probably going to pull out, which might create a minor crash in the market, which is probably more heavy than a certain market bloom for a little short time. But just thirdly, know that this isn't real money. Probably this won't happen, just like my first speaker explained. Therefore, really fast on OG, is moral bad? A, they didn't explain their moral. B, probably receiving agency is a better moral. So let's talk about bad credit score and how we weigh out to them. A, plausibility. I am not so sure if those people will have good credit score on the other side of the house. Note on our side of the house, the plausibility about monopolies is almost certain. But secondly, know that about scope. Know that those people probably, we are not talking about every single citizen, because probably if they know that they are getting such a bad credit score, they won't do it in both sides of the house. On our side of the house, again, probably more people are going to be affected. And just thirdly, probably they're symmetrical, because I am not so sure if those people can save up anyway. Therefore, something really important, why would those people go to Walmart and why monopolies are created? But before that, I will take a point from a wall.
So the options on delivery apps have vastly increased because of the guaranteed capital and costs being taken by individual companies for the exchange of advertising, which increases cheaper options for poor people, right?
No, because it increases risk and people don't want to do this with risk, right? In a moment that you are developing that certain specific market and you're making risky and riskier decisions, as I said, probably this will be creating a bubble in the best side, in the best scenario of your side of the house, and probably soon people are going to pull out because probably they will lose their money, because the more this industry is developed, the more the risk is, because the more people now have the possibility to not pay. So why would people go to Walmart? Three things. The first one that were already given by my first speaker was, comfortability. You're probably more comfortable. You feel more comfortable within the market. You know that you can buy more stuff. Secondly, access. You just have more access to more things in a moment that you don't have the money. But just thirdly, advertisement, that probably this specific policy is probably going to be well advertised by Walmart. Therefore, probably monopolies are going to be created because more people now go to Walmart and not to certain local shops. Therefore, really fast on CG. Know that influx of money might be important, but know that it's not real money. And if it means of crisis,
probably those markets won't like give that option to their customers because they know they will lose money because they don't have the money to pay back. But also, no like options like welfare loans from like really small loans are not with that high interest rates, and they can still get them in a moment that they are having trouble paying their bills. And things like lending can help them in those certain situations. Why is that outweighing monopolies? I didn't hear. And just really fastly on their response, oh, they won't have exclusive contracts. Know that A, the info site said it, but secondly, know that probably they will weigh more money over bargaining power. Vote CG.
I thank that speaker for their excellent speech. Would now like to call upon the opposition whip to close out this great round. You're here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Starting in 3. Actually, hang on. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 clashes in this debate on the outcomes for consumers and the outcomes for the market. Before that, 6 extraneous responses to CG's extension. 1, CG says that consumers are rational and cost saving and won't go into credit card debt for retail purchases, but will when it is a tipping point when they think they have an easy method for repayment. Naomi explains, and is the first speaker to do so, why often retail purchases are incredibly important to triage massive spending that may come later on down the line. CG misunderstood this claim. This is not about buying doctors or medical services. This is about buying gauze to stop bleeding on a wound, to preempt infection, to have to go see a doctor and then pay a large insurance bill. This is about buying pesticides to preempt the harm of a bug infestation in your home down the line that costs more. This can even be buying a winter coat for your child so they're not too cold during the winter months when they go to school, catch a cold, and then you get a medical bill when they come down with COVID or the flu. This offers people the unique ability to stem costs that would otherwise be much more down the line with significantly less risk of volatility due to changing interest rates, which happens over time. But secondly, you can use this to better manage existing loan debt and save more money. This was the second mechanism Naomi gave for why consumers have more options, which flips both OOG's and CG's version of this claim, because we explain how we are able to stem the bleeding of debt and also stem the bleeding of purchases. Insofar as some of these purchases are necessary on either side of the house, or at least important to make on either side of the house, we give these consumers more ability to do so. Their second claim is that this props up bubbles. Naomi explains why bubbles are far worse when credit card companies are monopolizing these sectors oligopolistically and have more of an ability to extend far larger lines of credit to more people who can go more in debt. This creates instability, whereas we get stability because we have transactions happening on different platforms and more manageable repayment plans as well, per the analysis in our case in opening oppositions. This means that bubbles happen less because the debt is less concentrated on one specific company, so MasterCard isn't going to over leverage to the same extent because now there are fewer people seeking out massive loans from them insofar as they're able to better cost manage and take out some loans from other companies. Then they say monopolization happens. This is interesting, but note there's no delta in terms of companies choosing to expand their market share over increasing profitability in this debate. Note that only large firms like Amazon or unicorn startups like WeWork are able to do this because their investors will back them no matter what, due to their market positioning or due to the fact that they are invested in the company's success because they believe that it is innovative. Insofar as this is true, we don't understand why most firms have the capacity to engage in this kind of expanding their market share over increasing their profitability. There's no link between partnering with these companies and doing so. Let me flip this claim though. Why? Because these firms have an incentive to partner with smaller firms at the point at which larger firms have more reach, more advertising, and are more ubiquitous, which means they see less of a need to partner with these kinds of companies like Afterpay in the first place. On contrast, the firms that are smaller, because there's a perceived need to offer flexibility to compete with large and ubiquitous firms, have an active incentive to seek out these partnerships. What this means is that at the point at which you draw consumers to smaller firms that utilize a partnership with Afterpay, you get comparatively larger piece of the transaction pie. This encourages and promotes competition in the sector to a much greater extent by giving flexibility as a leverage to counteract dominant firms, which drive down prices, but it also means you get less of a regulatory capacity for companies to put money into these kinds of things, like lobbying for like less antitrust regulations, because now they have to lower prices and take a loss in order to compete with these Afterpay plans who are linked up with smaller companies in order to compete in the first place, which means you have less of ability to like do bad antitrust actions and things like this. But I actually just think even if you don't buy this, this is uncomparative, right? Because large companies that are monopolies on the other side of the house because they have structural market power, tons of investors, economies of scale, and so on and so forth, not because they partner with Afterpay. So even if you believe their assertion that these large companies will be the ones that partner with them, I just don't think this is in a debate. On interest rates, one, OG has a lot of tension on this, where one hand they say higher interest rates are good, and on the other hand they say credit card companies have lower interest rates than these companies. Note that the framing Naomi gave you beats this on face, which is that often in some capacity purchases are likely to be made on either side of the house, because often these are purchases that you really should make to triage bleeding in terms of debt or in terms of potential harms to yourself or your family. In those cases, lower interest rates and more affordable services, which happen when you have competition to credit card companies, is the best way to decrease burden on the poor. Finally, on weighing, the problem with CG is that even if these consumers don't have great competition, this is compared to the the credit card industry, which is quite an oligopolistic market. At the very least, we have a proliferation of many of these firms. For the info slide, they have like 5 or 6 at best. Now let's clash on consumers, which is the majority of Top Half clash. What does Top Half do here? Look, I think OO beats OG, but they never take the highest burden, which is to disprove the OG framing that people make bad decisions. Naomi does this. OG says there's a moral harm to these companies that amounts to exploitation. The logical extension of their principle is that debt, charging interest, and so on is bad because they are also exploitation for the same logic. Here's why this argument doesn't work. Exploitation is defined as no alternative. That is, if people are coerced into using the service by force, maybe this would be exploitation. If this was the only way people could finance purchases via debt, this would also be an example of exploitation. But we increase the aggregate amount of agency by increasing options that people will have, which means the degree of exploitation is less on our side. OG says, it's a bad option. But if it is in some instances, we explain why in some instances it can be better than credit cards as well, which is still a comparative win because people will opt for credit cards when it's better and opt for this when they need it, when it's like very necessary. Their second contention is that people make poor financial decisions as a result of this policy. This is critical because opening opposition's analysis in response to this goes just as far to say as, poor people know their situation well, therefore they make rational decisions. This is an assertion, and Naomi's material as to why structurally people will make good financial decisions clashes with the explicitly, fills the logical gap in opening opposition and beats opening government. Because when Naomi explains that people want to know where they get the next salary and often waiting for some money when they opt into these deals, on particular ones, there are other kind of payments that need to be made like large credit card bills. Unlike other systems, it's more predictable because late fee is something that is established. They can do better cost-benefit analysis, and they likely exhaust other alternatives first, like talking to friends or families that can exist. They also know they could get locked out of the app if they wind up going into debt and not be able to make these purchases before. They can compare with other options of debt financing like credit cards to see which is better. All of these things mean we beat opening government on their own metric by explaining that rationality is the way to go. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from opening gov.
Yeah, so obviously there are reasons why, rational reasons for you to manage your debt well, like not wanting to get shut out of the app. Our point is that the way that these things operate, because of the short-term biases and because of the nudge theory, makes you override those rational
biases are exactly
otherwise
symmetric insofar as credit card companies have the same incentive to induce you to spend, but they are significantly worse at the point at which they charge interest rates, which are necessarily more volatile. Interest rates could be low on your side of the house at the point at which people opt in and might induce them to spend. It could then be raised because the Fed raises interest rates in order to combat inflation, putting these people in significantly more debt. The comparative is a stable form of repayment that is better able to operate. This means that it is likely that people default to ours. That's why you're out of this debate. 3, on inflation. This is orthogonal to the debate, but insofar as it's happening in the US, it actually makes it easier to pay back debt, right? Because if the US dollar becomes cheaper, debts are dollarized, or in countries that are pegged to the dollar, it means that most consumers are able to pay back their debts faster. We say that's good. Then they try to say loan issuance gets worse on our side. There's no mechanism for this, but this is not a tipping point in terms of loan issuance because these people don't use these apps, which probably causes lower prices. Opening opposition. Opening opposition says that loan sharks will fill in these gaps in the absence of these services. They never actually do the Lakely comparative, which is assuming that people have access to credit card companies and few people have access to loan sharks, what the credit card company comparative is. We prove why these services are structurally worse. Also says you could buy goods or services that you could otherwise not access, and access is important. But this is continued on them proving that consumers will make rational decisions because even if they have access to both, it's unclear. Naomi's analysis is logically prior to theirs then. They also say you open up developing nations and economic uncertainty happens. This could be true, but it's unlikely it's a tipping point because countries' monetary policy, interest rates, whether or not these countries have large state debt obligations or if they're involved in a sovereign debt dispute are all factors that also influence investor confidence. They never prove the benefit of opening up to developing economies always happens. Naomi beats O on 3 fronts then. Firstly, by explaining why and when these purchases are made, why it's important, and secondly, explaining why the app is better than credit card companies structurally, which means my final point of clash, benefits of companies existing on the market. This is where we really win because no other team explained why the existence of these companies incentivizes better markets. The big impact Naomi runs here is ad revenue. Our material about advertising and competition is necessary in proving the OO claim that competition with credit card companies exists. So we co-opt their impact, which explains why lower interest rates are good. Given these apps have ad revenue as well, whereas credit card companies do less of it, because these apps have an alternate income stream, whereas credit card companies are relying on degrees of interest rates, this means it's significantly worse. This also means we preempt bubbles and monopolization, right? Because credit card companies are like the ones to extend the most capital to risky investment ventures because they have large banks backing them and so on and so forth. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their excellent speech and for closing off what's been a really good debate. You can cross and shake hands. Thanks again. By the way, congrats for reaching the quarterfinals. I forgot to mention that up front. All the best for next round. And if possible, I think how it works is it would be preferable if you all leave the breakout room so that the panel can discuss.
Thanks everyone for debate. Shake hands, shake hands.
Thank you.